part of the reason for this talk is that you can't reject a position unless you understand the arguments for it, or at least you shouldn't. Uh, there's the idea I've heard that you ought to be able to argue any side that you disagree with as well as the people who agree with it before you decide that that side is wrong. So what I want to do is to explain the concept of market failure, explain why it is a legitimate argument against the libertarian position, but claim that it's an even stronger argument for the libertarian position. Uh, and let me start with the question of what market failure is. Like a lot of technical terms, it sounds self-explanatory and isn't. Market failure sounds as though it means markets failing, but in fact, it's not limited to markets. It does not describe all kinds of failure. And I will try to explain why it is in fact an interesting and useful idea for quite a lot of different reasons. What is it? Why it is an argument against the libertarian position, a stronger argument for it, because the things that make market failure happen are things that occasionally happen on the private market and routinely happen on the political market. I will also try to explain why the idea of market failure is relevant to lots of other things, like how to win battles, which hopefully will never be relevant to any of us, marriage, which is relevant to me and presumably will be to some of you, and how to make money, which is relevant to almost everybody. So what is market failure? Market failure describes situations where individually rational action does not produce group rational action. In the extreme case, each person correctly does what's in his own interest, and we're all worse off as a result. The reason it happens is that I'm taking an action which benefits me but hurts you. I act in terms of my cost and benefits, not yours. You are doing the same thing in the other direction. And my favorite example is an imaginary situation about 1,000 years ago, where we are part of a line of 10,000 men with spears. We're all facing in that direction. Sorry, let me get my hand up where you can see it. And the reason we're doing it is that in that direction, there are 10,000 more men, only they're on horseback, and they have spears too, and they're coming at us. And so I do a very, very quick cost-benefit calculation. I say, if all of us stand and we hold our spears solidly, with luck, we can stop their charge. And if we stop their charge, some of us will die, but some of us will live. If we try to run away, horses run faster than we do, so I should stand. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. I said we. I don't control the people on each side of me. If I stand and everybody else runs, I'm dead. If everybody else runs, my only chance is to run faster. On the other hand, if I run and everybody else stands, I'm only one man out of 10,000. The chances that we'll stop their charge are almost as good without me as with me. And if I run, I won't be one of the ones killed. So I correctly calculate that I'm better off running. Everybody else in the army makes the same calculation. We all run and most of us die. Welcome to the dark side of rationality. All right, that's a case where my decision to run helps me and hurts everybody else. Everyone else is in the same situation. We all correctly figure our self-interest, and the result is an unattractive result. All right. A more mundane example, which I used to observe when I was teaching at UCLA, there was an intersection south of the University of California in Los Angeles, which the locals claimed was the busiest intersection in the world. I don't know if it's true. But you could see each day that when the light was about to go red, cars going one way would pull into the intersection trying to get across. Light goes red, the intersection is jammed in that direction. Cars can't go the other way. Eventually, the intersection empties just in time for cars coming the other way to jam the intersection that time when the light goes red. So if everybody had politely waited to pull into the intersection until he was sure that he could get across, everybody would get home faster. But each person is better off doing what he's doing. For a still more familiar example, which I suspect you've all experienced, it is frustrating to be in a restaurant or a bar and not be able to hear anyone because everybody is talking too loudly. Why is everybody talking too loudly? Because at the initial level of sound, if I want to be heard, I have to speak a little louder. So then if you want to be heard, you have to speak a little louder. And you end up with everybody speaking like this instead of speaking like this in a reasonable voice. All right. So those are all examples of market failure. Those are all cases where each person is making the correct decision for himself, and yet we're worse off. Why is this an argument against libertarianism? Because it undercuts the simplest argument for the libertarian position. And the simplest argument is that each person knows his own interest. Each person acts in his own interest. Since each of us is maximizing the benefits for him, that maximizes the total benefits for everybody, so there's no need for the government to intervene. That's the simple argument for laissez-faire, for leaving people alone to run their own lives. And it's a pretty persuasive argument, but unfortunately it's wrong. And what's wrong is the one I've just illustrated, that there are some situations where I get the benefit and somebody else gets the cost of my action. So that when I put smoke into the air, the result is that my house is warm, I'm burning coal to heat it, but I get a little bit of coughing, a little bit of the air pollution, but most of it goes to other people. Similarly, if I drive dangerously, some of the risk goes to me, but much of the risk goes to the people I may run into, but I'm the one who gets the benefit of getting home faster. And these are what economists call negative externalities, cases where my action imposes costs on others. You also have the same effect in the opposite direction. Sometimes I bear the cost of something and somebody else gets the benefit. So, for example, if I broadcast a radio program, I can't control who listens to it, so they get the benefit of hearing the program. I've got the cost of putting it on. Similarly, for a variety of other things, such as basic scientific research. And that means that even if the benefit to other people is larger than the cost to me, I don't do it, which means I've missed an opportunity for something that would make us on the whole better off. That's what economists usually refer to as the public good problem. Public good is another one of these confusing technical terms. It doesn't mean something the government produces. It means the kind of good where the producer can't control who gets it, such as a radio broadcast. Now, sometimes there are market solutions to these problems. Sometimes you solve the externality problem by putting both the beneficiary and the person who's paying the cost into a single firm. So if you compare, I don't know what it's like in Georgia, but in the US, shopping centers, malls, are generally much cleaner and pleasanter places than village streets. Why? Because the mall belongs to a company that's renting out space in it to stores. Any benefit that the proprietors of the mall produce that make the mall a pleasanter place to be means more people come, means they can charge more rent to the stores in the mall. They have an incentive in deciding what stores to have in the mall to make sure that if there is a movie theater, there's also a late night restaurant near it. If there's a late night restaurant, there's a movie theater near it, in general, to arrange things to coordinate external problems. Similarly, some public good problems can be dealt with by ingenuity. Some unknown genius many years ago solved the problem of producing radio broadcasts by thinking of the idea of producing not one public good, but two. One of the public goods has a positive cost of production and a positive value to the consumer, and it's called a radio broadcast. One of the public goods has a negative value to the consumer and a negative cost to the broadcaster. It's called an advertisement. An advertisement has a negative cost of production because a firm will pay the radio station to put the ad on. And somebody said, aha, produce two public goods, tie them tightly together, and give away the package. And that's the way, at least in the US, I don't know the situation in Georgia, but the way in the US radio broadcasts get largely made. So there are ways in which clever people can solve these problems, but there is no guarantee that they will always work. So that you can imagine pretty easily market failure problems to which there isn't a solution. And the result of that is that there are situations where if you had a wise, benevolent dictator, he could step in and change the situation and benefit everybody. So he could regulate air pollution and dangerous driving. He could subsidize radio, television, and research. So the implication of this argument is that the result of the free market is imperfect, but it's imperfect in the sense that if you had a wise and benevolent ruler, he could in some cases make things better. But there's a problem with this. And the problem is that we have a striking shortage of wise and benevolent rulers. All right. So, in order for the argument to work as an argument for government, you need some reason to expect the government to do the right things. You need some way in which we make it in the interest of government actors to do those things that produce net benefits and not do the things that produce net costs. So instead of thinking of the government as a sort of a wise and benevolent figure standing over it, think of it more realistically as a bunch of people, just like the market. Individuals in the political system, you can think of as the political market, just as on the private market, use their reason to figure out what actions benefit them and act in that way. And so the question is, in the political market, what happens with regard to market failure? All right. And the answer is that most political decisions are made by people who neither pay the cost nor receive the benefit. And I should say, I'm not just talking about rulers or judges or police. I'm talking about you people too, and about me. You're political actors. I don't know the current situation in Georgia, but if it is a democracy, you are political actors as voters. If it's not a democracy, you're still political actors as people who can bribe rulers or start revolutions or do sorts of things that will affect the government. We're all political actors, just as we're all market actors. And there is no particular reason to expect that we, as political actors, or the judges, or the legislators, or the president, if you have a president, which I think you do, we do anyway, will actually take the actions that maximize net benefit. So let me run through some familiar examples of market failure on the political market. The theory of democracy, what I refer to as the civics class model of democracy, is that it works because the politicians have to do the actions that will benefit the voters, otherwise the voters will vote them out. In order for that to work, the voters have to know what the government is doing and whether what it is doing is in their interest. Information, however, is costly, and especially with governments the size of modern governments, simply paying attention to what the government is doing is a more than full-time job. Why should I do it? Why should I bother to spend lots of time and effort figuring out what laws have been passed, finding out whether the representative from my district voted for or against those laws, and then voting for or against him accordingly? The answer is that I have very little reason to do it, because at least in a large population society, my vote has almost no chance of changing the outcome. So if I think about it in terms of the US presidential system, which is the one I'm familiar with, roughly speaking, the chance that my vote will change the outcome of that election is somewhere around 1 in 5 million or 1 in 10 million, judging by past elections. So why should I spend many hours deciding who the better candidate is in order to change the chance of getting the better candidate by 1 in 5 million? It's a very poor deal. The result is that most voters are rationally ignorant. It is rational to be ignorant when the information costs more than it's worth. If you are rationally ignorant, then in deciding who to vote for, you support those policies that sound good to somebody who knows little about them, giving what I like to describe as a politics of sound bites and demagoguery. And if you don't believe me, just watch US news for the rest of the election. And you will see quite a lot of that. So that means that this mechanism that's supposed to make democracy work doesn't. There's a famous line usually attributed to Winston Churchill that democracy is the worst form of government invented by the mind of man, except for all of the others. And people usually take that as a defense of democracy, but that's wrong. That's a criticism of government. That's saying that even the best form of government works very badly. And I've just described part of the reason why what may, for all I know, be the best form of government works very badly. Let me give another example, and that's the fact that politicians rationally have very short time horizons. This is a claim that's often made mistakenly about the market. When people say companies only care about next year's bottom line. But it isn't true because we observe companies spending lots of money designing products that they expect to bring out 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years down the road. We observe that hardwoods, slow growing trees for lumber, are planted by private companies, even though they know it will be 20 or 30 years before they harvest the tree. But think about the equivalent calculation for a politician. Uh, I should say the last time I gave this talk, it was in Sao Paulo, Brazil. That's why that's the example on that particular slide. And there was a problem with the water system breaking down. And why was the water system breaking down? Because if the mayor of Sao Paulo spent his limited amount of money making sure that the pipes were repaired and the water system was fixed, the result would be that 10 years later, everything would go well. But of course, 10 years later, someone else will be mayor of Sao Paulo, and he will have less money available to spend on things that get him votes today, such as giving money to poor voters or spending money subsidizing rich companies that will then help him, or doing any of the things that politicians actually do. All right, so that if you imagine a politician trying to decide whether to do the equivalent of planting hardwoods, whether to make an investment whose benefit to the population will show up in 20 years, he will correctly say, if right now the voters are rationally ignorant, so they won't know whether I'm giving them a benefit 20 years from now. When they see the benefit 20 years from now, they won't know that I'm responsible. Somebody else will get the credit. I'll get the blame for spending my money on that instead of something else. Now, you may have noticed that politicians make the opposite claim. Politicians routinely claim that they are doing actions now for long run future benefits. But of course, the reason for that is that the future benefits are invisible, so you can lie about them, whereas the present costs are real. And my standard example of that, as it happens, is the most famous Georgian in history, uh, namely Joseph Stalin. That Stalin could not plausibly tell the Russian people, you have things well now, because the Russian people knew that they were living one family to a room, at least in a good deal of Moscow, that there were long lines in the stores, that they were having a very unpleasant life. And at least those of them who had gone abroad could see that in the evil capitalist countries, people were much better off. But Stalin could tell the people, yes, you're suffering now, but you're suffering now to build a Soviet Union such that your children will be richer than the Americans. And he could thus, for a while, persuade people to support him, even though they could see that in terms of current circumstances, he was doing a very bad job. So that's an extreme example, but I can assure you that American politicians are just as willing to do that as was a no longer alive Georgian politician for the same reason. That is, you claim. I mean, indeed, there's even a line by Lewis Carroll: "Jam tomorrow and jam yesterday, but never jam today." And you can deliver jam tomorrow because by the time tomorrow comes, somebody else is in office and they won't notice the jam hasn't come, but doesn't work in the present. Eventually, that system broke down, and you're the beneficiaries of the fact that people eventually stopped believing it. But it worked for a fair while. Let me give another example, and this is from the U.S. situation, and that is that we have a situation where if a company wants to bring out a new medical drug, they have to get approval from the FDA, the Federal Drug Administration. So think about the incentives of the regulators. the incentives of the people who are deciding whether to approve a new medical drug. If they approve a drug and it turns out to have a side effect that nobody expected, and 100 people die, the regulator is finished. He's the person responsible for killing 100 people. Suppose instead he delays the drug. He says, you've got to do more testing before we're sure it's safe. The result is that a drug that would have saved lives, that would have meant that 80% of the people get cured instead of 75% of the people getting cured, is not available for a few more years. 1,000 extra people die. And there's no cost at all to the regulator, because 1,000 people in the medical statistics are invisible. And my favorite example of that is a real case, and that's the press release where the FDA in the US admitted to killing 100,000 people. That's not, of course, the way they put the press release. There was a category of drugs called beta blockers, which were used to prevent a second heart attack. And they were widely used outside of the US. But the FDA refused to approve them for about a decade. When the FDA finally decided to approve one of the beta blockers, Timolol, I think, they had a press release in which they said that the use of this beta blocker would save 8,000 to 10,000 lives a year. Well, if the use of it saves 10,000 lives a year, and if they kept it off the market for about 10 years, that means that their decision killed 100,000 people. But of course, that's not the way the headlines put it. In fact, there weren't any headlines, but it's not the way the press release put it. So those are all examples where rational behavior by people in the political system can have net negative effects, because their actions impose costs mostly on other people, or benefits mostly on other people, not on themselves. Sorry. Take the case of judges or legislators. Suppose, I assume, does Georgia have a European or American style legal system? Is it a civil law or common law? No, you don't have to tell me. It doesn't matter. Either way, in the US, law is partly made by judges. So a judge decides a case, especially a high-level judge such as the Supreme Court, that sets a precedent. That affects the legal rule in the future. The US also has laws made by legislators, which is the standard European system, which again determine what the legal rules are. Suppose you get it wrong. Suppose you make a slightly bad law or a slightly bad legal decision. And the result is that from then on, the national income of Georgia is 0.1% lower. That's a tiny effect. Nobody's going to know it happened. 0.1% of the national income of Georgia is about $34 million a year. So that means that a legislature or a judge could make a mistake that costs $34 million a year, and neither he nor anybody else ever notices. We don't have a good feedback system. A private firm that makes mistakes loses money, and that's a pretty good reason why they should correct their mistakes. Right? So the conclusion that I'm arguing for is that market failure indeed exists on the private market, that the normal situation on the private market is that if you want to use things, you have to pay for them. If I want to hire people to produce something, I've got to pay them enough so they're willing to work for me. If I want to buy inputs to produce something, I've got to pay the producers of those inputs enough so they're willing to sell them. But there are sometimes situations where individuals either impose costs on others without their consent, such as air pollution, or provide benefits to other people they can't collect from, as in the case of a public good. Therefore, there are sometimes cases where individual rationality on the private market does not produce group rationality. But the alternative to the private market is not a benevolent, wise despot making all the decisions. It's the political market. And the same causes that produce market failure on the private market are much more common on the political market, because political actors almost never bear the costs of their actions. They almost never receive many of the benefits of their actions. They therefore have no incentive to make the choices that maximize net benefit to all. Right? That implies that market failure is an argument for government intervention in markets, but a stronger argument against, because shifting authority to government is more likely to increase the problem than to decrease it. And the conclusion depends on the fact that I am applying the same analysis to both the political market and the private. Rather than thinking of the political market as something handed down by heaven where good people do good things, I am assuming that individuals on the political market, just as on the private market, mostly are concerned with their welfare, the welfare of the people immediately around them who are important to them. I care about my wife, my children, friends. I care a little bit about the rest of the world, but much less. And I assume that's true both about actors on the private market and on the political market. That in each case, I'm willing to assume that politicians are rational, just as I assume that businessmen and consumers and workers are rational. But instead of assuming that government automatically does the right thing, we try to figure out what are the incentives that determine what government does. All right. Now, market failure is relevant to lots and lots of other things. I've described the military relevance. If you imagine yourself as a general, part of the problem you're trying to solve is how to create the situation I described earlier where the army runs away for the other guy's army and avoid creating it for your army. One of the solutions is actually a proverb, at least in English. And the proverb is burning your bridges behind you. So you imagine that you want to make sure your army doesn't run away. So what do? You march your army across a bridge, across a river. You line up the army to face the enemy, and you burn the bridge. Your soldiers now know that they can't run away, so they have to fight. Sometimes this works, and sometimes it doesn't work, and you all get killed if the other guy wins anyway. An ancient example, but an interesting one, is a very famous military unit in classical antiquity. It was a military unit of the city of Thebes in Greece, and it consisted entirely of pairs of homosexual lovers, no one of whom would ever show cowardice in the presence of his beloved. They won every battle they fought in until the last, when they encountered a Macedonian army commanded by Philip of Macedon and his son Alexander, later to be known as Alexander the Great, and they died to a man. So that was a solution to the problem. And there are other solutions that other militaries have tried in the past. Let me go on to an example in my profession. And that's what I think of as the silent student problem. That I explain to the students in my class some point in economics that I have explained 1,000 times before, and that seems perfectly obvious to me. And I then say, now, did everybody understand my explanation of the principle of comparative advantage? And nobody says anything. So I assume the answer is yes, they understood it. I go on, and I only discover my mistake when I grade the final exam and discover that most of them didn't understand it. What's happening? The students are acting rationally. Each student who knows he doesn't understand it feels that if he says so, that will embarrass him in front of the other students. He'll look stupid. He doesn't know they don't know it. It'll make me think he's stupid, and maybe I'll give him a lower grade at the end. So each student rationally stays silent, and none of them learn what happens to be an important point in economics. I have a solution to this problem. I haven't actually done it, I should say. I'm only a theorist. I let other people implement things. But my solution is you equip a classroom with a small button at each place on the floor so that a student can unobtrusively push the button with his toe. At the back of the classroom, there is a sign which shows how many buttons are pushed. So I say, well, everybody who thinks he clearly understands the principle of comparative advantage, please push his button. The number 2 appears on the screen at the back of the class, and I go back and explain the idea again. So that would be a case of engineering around market failure, of finding a way of changing the situation to change the incentives such that people now behave in the way that you want them to behave. And similarly, if you're going to be running a firm, part of the problem in running a firm is somehow setting it up as nearly as possible so that the individuals in the firm get a reward that depends on how they have affected the profits of the firm. Which may mean that instead of having a single organization, you have several different sub-organizations so that it's easier to track the effect of each person's action. Another example has to do with how to run a household. Sometimes my wife cooks dinner, sometimes I do. Which of us should clean up? All right. This isn't an issue of fairness because we're taking turns, but one possible policy is I cook and I clean up, then she cooks and she cleans up. And the alternative policy is I cook and she cleans up, and then she cooks and I clean up. Which one should you follow? I'm only interested in answers from people who actually cook. Any answers? Anyone in the audience want to tell me? That I cook and I clean up? Yes, you're right. Why? The answer is because the cook makes decisions that affect how much cleaning up is needed. You can do a one pot meal, in which case there's a lot less cleaning up than if you've gotten 3 frying pans and 4 saucepans dirty in the course of making your elaborate meal. You can decide whether, while the water for the second step of your meal is coming to a boil, you spend the time sitting and gossiping or spend the time cleaning up from the first step in your there are a whole bunch of different ways that you can affect how much of a cleaning up is to be done. And even though I love my wife, my time and effort are more visible to me than hers is. And therefore, if I know that I'm the one who's cleaning up the mess, I have a better incentive to avoid making a mess. All right. And this, of course, applies not only to husbands and wives, it also applies to parents and children. That when your small child makes a mess, it's almost always less work to clean up the mess yourself than to get the child to clean up the mess. But if that's what you did, there would be no reason for the child not to make messes. All right. So these are applications of economics in daily life. Another way of thinking about it is that market failure is another name for a profit opportunity. Because the existence of a market failure means that there's some way of changing what's happening that would produce net benefits. And if you're clever enough to figure out a way of doing it, you might be able to arrange for some of those net benefits to end up in your pocket. So that the first person who thought about broadcasting radio programs with advertisements. Or for a modern example, Google has a very ingenious business model. What's the service they produce? The main service they produce is a search engine. What do they charge me to use their search engine? Nothing at all. Isn't that kind of them? Isn't that generous of them? No, it's smart of them. Because what they do instead is they charge firms for coming up in their search engine, in particular for coming up high on their search engine. Similarly for whoever first invented the shopping center, and you can think of other examples. Let me take another example that I'm rather fond of, and this is my camel story. 2 Bedouins are riding their camels through the desert with the oasis a couple of miles away. And the first Bedouin starts complaining about his camel. This camel, if it is a camel, I think it's really a very large snail, is the slowest beast in all the deserts of Arabia. And the other Bedouin says, "You think your camel is slow? Let me tell you about this log that I'm riding." And they get into an argument about whose camel is slower. And they decide to make a bet that whoever's camel gets to the oasis last wins the bet. That's the slower camel. And so that the Bedouin whose camel wins the bet gets paid 2 golden dinar by the other Bedouin. All right, they're betting 2 dinar, gold coin, on whose camel is slower. Well, you can see what happens. One of them goes slowly, and the other goes more slowly, and the first one goes more slowly still because they both want to win the bet. And so after an hour, there are 2 Bedouins sitting their camels stock still in the blazing sun with the oasis still a mile away. And at this point, a wise man comes walking by and he says, "Why are you two idiots sitting your camels stock still in the blazing sun with the oasis a mile away?" And they get off their camels in order to explain the problem to him. And he says two words to them, and they jump on the camels and race off to the oasis as fast as ever they can. What are the two words? All right. That when each one is riding the other one's camel, he wants to go fast instead of slow so that his camel will come in last. So that's a sort of a very simple example of engineering around market failure. They've managed to set up a situation where the rational behavior of each produces a bad result, and they've gotten, or someone has gotten around it. All right. If you want a whole lot more stuff along these lines, here is my website and here is my blog. The website has the full text. Have your lights just gone off? It's just gotten dark on my screen. You have. Uh, the website has the uh, full text number of my books. Uh, I haven't counted, probably 4 or 5 books there, as well as references to the others. And the blog has whatever I feel like talking about. All right, I think that finishes what I want to say. If you have questions, I will be happy to talk about your questions. Uh, the nice thing about answering a question is you could be pretty sure at least one person in the room is interested in what you're talking about.
So I have two questions. Question number one would be, if we go back to your machinery of freedom, you are describing law enforcement agencies and rights enforcement agencies, sorry, and also arbitration agencies. So the question which always arises when I explaining this concept to someone, they're asking why people are going to pay for that. Why then they aren't going to be freeloaders or free riders?
Because if you do not pay for a rights enforcement agency, your rights will not get protected. If you don't pay for a rights, if you are not the customer of a rights enforcement agency, then when somebody robs you, you have nothing to do. There's nobody you can call who will go after the person who robbed you. But individuals are not paying for the arbitration agencies. The rights enforcement agencies are paying for the arbitration agencies. So it's a two-layered system where you are the customer of a rights enforcement agency, and every pair of rights enforcement agencies agree on a arbitrator, on a private court, in order that they can settle their disputes peacefully.
Okay, I understand that. Thank you. But so final cost still goes to buyer. I mean, cost from arbitration agents. First, it transfers to rights enforcement agencies, and they transfer it to buyers, right?
Yes.
Okay. So if we tie this to today's lecture, so people who are living on the same street, like, and this street is controlled by these agencies. I mean, rights enforcement agencies. They are still protected, right? Because there is no crime, less crime at least. And they may say, oh, why I'm going to pay for that? Why let my neighbor pay?
It's actually a little more complicated than that. You are correct that there are going to be some externalities involved in rights enforcement, and that therefore you will not get a perfect result. But it's not at all clear what the sign of the externalities is, because one result of the fact that I'm the customer of a rights enforcement agency might be that the robber doesn't bother to come into my street because if he robs my house, he'll get in trouble. But another result might be that he doesn't rob me, he robs my neighbor who isn't a customer on the grounds that it's dangerous robbing me and it's safer to rob my neighbor. So you, in fact, get externalities in both directions. That in some ways, the fact that I'm paying to have my rights protected helps my neighbors, in some ways, it hurts them. But I think I've just spent about half an hour answering your question, because the answer is that, of course, it won't do a perfect job, that there you might end up with either more or less than the optimal amount of rights enforcement, but it comes much closer than the alternative, because to first approximation, as it were, I only get protected if I'm paying for it. Now, you've probably read the second edition of Machinery of Freedom, because that's the edition that's free on my webpage. The third edition has about another 100 pages, and that includes a chapter which is a discussion of market failure on the market for law. And what I'm looking at there is not your problem of whether people pay to be protected, but the question of what are the legal rules that are generated by my system. Because in my system, the law itself is being produced on the marketplace by the arbitration agencies, which are adopting those legal rules that customers want to be under in order that rights enforcement agencies will hire those arbitration agencies. And there are some cases in which the legal rule between me and you has effects on other people. And so I run through the situations in which you will get a non-optimal legal rule, as it were, because of the fact that there is market failure on that market. And those certainly will exist. But again, the argument is only you have a system where, as it were, the first approximation, you do it exactly right. There are then various deviations from that, so you won't do it exactly right. But we have no system that does it exactly right. And this one we would expect to come much closer than the alternative. That's the basic argument. It's the argument I've just been making.
Thank you. And one more short question, and
Sure.
that's all. When I was explaining this concept to one, I guess, Clara guy, he asked such a thing, why can't people just don't buy uh, this rights enforcement agency service and skip them because they will say like I can arm myself and I do not need to buy the service, and they say that but I want to buy arbitration agency service, okay, because I want to see how world is made according to my desires. Okay, and even then there are two layers, right? So one is court, and another is creation of law. So people may even say that we do not want a court. Let's court play by itself, but we want to once again see the world arranged according to our desires, and let's buy
But
law.
but remember that in order for you to be under the law of an arbitration agency, the other person who you're having conflict with has got to be under it as well. So that you have to somehow negotiate agreements with everybody in the world, or at least with all of the rights enforcement agencies, to use the arbitration agencies that you want. And they are going to consider how those agencies will affect their customers in deciding it. But you could imagine somebody who chooses not to have a rights enforcement agency to protect himself, just as you can imagine somebody in our world who grows all his own food instead of buying it from a grocery store or from farmers. But most people, I think, will find that the division of labor works and that they are therefore better off doing it. There's an interesting science fiction story by Werner Vinge called The Ungoverned, which is about the invasion of a anarcho-capitalist society by an adjacent state. And in that one, his anarcho-capitalist society has people he refers to as armadillos. And an armadillo is the person you're describing. He's somebody who says, I'm not going to be part of this whole network, I'll just protect myself. It's an interesting story, and I'm particularly fond of it because at the end of it, Vinge refers to my book, Machinery of Freedom, as the model for which the fictional story he's giving is. But it's part of what's fun about the story is that he's not an economist, he's a very good fiction writer. And the result is that he sort of puts life into my model, makes it describes, I think, in an interesting and plausible way what it would look like sort of in the real world. So I recommend The Ungoverned by Werner Vinge. I have no idea, probably is not a Georgian translation, but obviously all of you speak English or else you've been wasting the last 45 minutes.
Morning, David. Thank you for a very interesting lecture. So I wanted to ask a bit more general question, I guess. So
Yes.
we have established that politicians are a problem to different degrees in different countries, but they definitely impact the markets. So my
Yes.
question would be, is there anything that the markets can do about that? And if there is indeed anything that can be done about that? I mean, one way or another, the markets always get impacted by the politicians. In most cases, negative impact. So
Yeah.
what's the solution?
That is, I don't think of it in terms of the market, but in terms of individual action of what you can do. and there are a bunch of different ways in which you can try to improve the world. One of them is what I've just spent the last 45 minutes doing. That is, you can try to spread ideas which will make people less willing to support political intervention in markets, more willing to support moves towards freer markets. Another thing you can do is to create private alternatives to what government is doing. So that in the US, if somebody 40 years ago had suggested that we abolish the post office, it would have been an obviously crazy idea. People would say, how would you get the mail delivered? If somebody proposed it today, it might not be a bad idea. People might still oppose it, but they would recognize that we have several other organizations, the UPS and Federal Express are the two biggest ones in the US, which do roughly what the post office does. They would do it privately. And if we didn't have a post office, they'd just expand to fill the gap. So one of the things you can do is to try to find areas where you can produce private substitutes for the government's policies, which hopefully do a better job than the government and therefore make people feel less inclined to believe that they need government to do it. So there are other things you can do. You can try to organize politically, and I would have said that as a general rule, libertarian parties should be seen mainly as ways of spreading ideas, not mainly as ways of getting elected. My guess is that the current presidential election, the libertarian candidate will get more votes than any libertarian candidate has ever gotten before, but that's because both of the major candidates are very unpopular. And there will be a lot of people who want to find someone else to vote. But even with that, Gary Johnson is not going to be president, unfortunately. He might get 5%. He might, if he's very lucky, 10% of the votes. On the other hand, if he can get 15%, which is the limit for getting into the presidential debates, that will give him a very large audience for libertarian ideas. And short of that, he's getting attention. So political activity isn't something I enjoy doing, but it's a one way of getting attention for your ideas. But basically, you have to spread ideas. You have to try to change the world in ways that make things work better. But I don't think there is a simple answer, unfortunately. If there were, we'd all be free already. And as you may have noticed, we aren't. So I don't think I can give you any. Now, one thing you may want to think about, by the way, if you are doing political activity, whether in the form of spreading ideas or electing candidates, is what are the incentives within that activity? All right, that just as it's rational to be an ignorant voter, it's also rational to be a citizen who doesn't try to engage in politics because you know your chances of affecting is pretty. So therefore, if you want political action, you've got to find indirect ways of making it in people's interest to engage in it. So if you actually think about the incentives for political action, an awful lot of it is interacting with people who share your values in order to make friends, maybe even find a husband or a wife or a girlfriend or a boyfriend, a whole bunch of social payoffs, which come out indirectly, which aren't theoretically what the organization is about, but is the reason why such organizations actually function. All right. I've been commenting recently in the US. There's an organization which also exists in, for all I know, in Georgia, called Students for Liberty. And what has impressed me in the US about Students for Liberty is that the ratio of women to men is closer to even than in any libertarian organization I've ever observed before. And I see that as a healthy situation because from the standpoint of both the men and the women, it means most of whom are interested in socializing with members of the opposite sex. It means it's a more attractive environment, and you then get your political benefits as a side payment, as it were, a side benefit. Just as Google, all right? Google is providing an enormous benefit to us in the form of a search engine, does it for free. Why? Because there's an indirect benefit, namely the fact that it can charge companies to come up high in the search results, which it can fund. And similarly, if you're going to save the world, you're going to have to make it in people's interest to do it. And guys looking for girls and girls looking for guys happens to be one of the central human activities which motivates things. There's a long time ago, there was a Playboy interview of a prominent right-wing Texas oil millionaire. And he had a chain of radio stations, which, among other things, preached his political ideas. And the interviewer assumed that he was subsidizing the stations. And he said, "Oh, no, no, I'm not subsidizing the stations. They make money. If this country is worth saving, it's worth saving at a profit." It's a great line. And it's not a correct statement, morally speaking. After all, it would be worth saving if it isn't. But if you actually want to save the country, you've got to do it at a profit. Profit broadly defined. You've got to set up things so that people are getting something that they value out of the activity that's saving the country.
Before you gave your lecture, I was trying to explain what is the difference between you and Ayn Rand, because Ayn Rand is very popular here in Georgia. The biggest financial firm of Georgia is called Gold and Taggart, and many people don't know why that is the case, but I know, and I told the others here. And it was a bit difficult for me to really work out where you differ, and let's say what are the most decisive points where you don't agree.
Yeah, I think there are two major points. The most important one is philosophy, not politics. And that is that Rand thinks she has solved the problem of deriving ought from is. That she believes that she can show people rationally what they ought to want to do, essentially, what's right and wrong. I don't think she's done that. That's what interested me first when I encountered Rand, because it's a very interesting claim if you can make it. And the third edition of Machinery of Freedom has got a chapter which is my explanation of why I think her argument doesn't work. And if you look hard enough, although the third edition is not available to be read for free, the extra chapters in the third edition are. So with a little bit of Google practice, I can't give you the URL because I don't remember it at the moment. I webbed the additional chapters as drafts when I was writing it, and those are almost final drafts. And so with a little search, you ought to be able to find a chapter of mine that's on the subject of why I think Rand is wrong about that. Alternatively, if you go to my webpage and you go to the libertarian chunk of my webpage, I have a different version of the same explanation on there. So that's the really important difference. The minor difference is that Rand didn't believe in anarchy, and I do. That is, Rand thought you needed a limited government. I think a limited government is a utopian proposal, but that's people care about that. But philosophically speaking, that's not a big difference. I mean, my father thought that probably my system wouldn't work, but that wasn't a major difference. I thought it probably would work and might not, and he thought it probably wouldn't but might. Now, beyond that, I should say I'm an admirer of Rand. Rand was brilliant. She was courageous. She was also a bit crazy. She was also arrogant. My interpretation of Rand, and I may be wrong, is that she has the personality that comes out of growing up with nobody equally smart around you. So that she was a very bright woman, and she concluded pretty early that when people disagreed with her, it was because they didn't understand. It was because they were wrong. And that's a natural enough assumption if you're a very smart person surrounded by ordinary people. But eventually you end up in a world where you're interacting with other very smart people, and now the assumption is no longer correct. So I think that's my reading. She's also a brilliant writer, I should say. I mean, I think there was a television program where she was being interviewed, and the interviewer said that people complain that your work is not in the mainstream of American literature. And Rand's reply, as best I remember with a Russian accent, was, "The mainstream of American literature is a stagnant swamp." So yeah, she wrote very odd books, but she wrote them very well, as demonstrated on the market by how many copies she sold. And large parts of what she said were correct, but not all of it.
Morning, David.
Morning.
I have a question based on your previous answer. You said something like that libertarian intellectuals should not be taking political offices and should not be elected or something like that, and instead...
I didn't say should not be. I said I didn't think it was a good strategy for changing things. Yeah.
So they should be, well, That's your thought, that they should not be, I don't know, trying to get into politics and just in terms of being elected, like for executive.
I think what I'm saying is that I think libertarians in politics function mainly as a way of spreading ideas, not as a way of changing policies. So that Ron Paul, I think, helped the libertarian movement by the visibility he got as a result of being a congressman. But I don't think that his votes in Congress affected anything because he was outnumbered 450 to 1, roughly. And I think that if we succeed in spreading libertarian ideas, there will be lots of non-libertarians willing to implement them because there will be politicians who want to get elected. So that, let me give a real world example. Back about 50 years ago, Ronald Coase, who was a very important and rather unconventional economist, pointed out that the right solution to the problem of who gets to broadcast radio programs when and where was to use private property instead of government regulation. So the system in the US at the time was that if you wanted to have a radio station, you got a license from the FCC. And the FCC was supposed to decide whether your broadcasts were in the public interest or not. And the argument was, look, we've got a limited amount of radio spectrum. If two stations broadcast on the same frequency, neither can be heard. And Coase said, well, that's true, but we have limited amounts of land and manpower and oil and everything else. And the normal solution to that is to have a market. So he suggested that you simply auction off the airwaves. That was clearly a crazy idea that nobody would do. It's currently, in a somewhat modified form, the official policy of the US government. So that was a case where he put an idea out, and it was a good enough idea so that eventually people who were not ideologically committed to believing in the market adopted it. And there are other examples of that sort. So I think that it's not that it's wicked to be in politics. It's just that I think that the sensible strategy is not one which aims at finding good people and getting them elected, but aims at making it in the interest of not good people to do the right thing. And my standard example of that is one of the most successful political parties in the US history, and that's the Socialist Party. And the Socialist Party, I think, elected a mayor of Milwaukee at one point, maybe a couple of other local politicians. But I don't remember if they ever had anybody in Congress, but they certainly never came close to winning a presidential election. They never had any significant number of congressmen. But if you look at the platform of the Socialist Party at the beginning of the 20th century, most of it's now law, because they spread their ideas and made their ideas popular so that the other parties adopted them. So it seems to me that the sensible strategy for libertarians aims not so much at putting a whole lot of effort to get a good guy elected, and more at putting your effort into making our ideas popular so that politicians who want to get elected will follow them. That's the basic point I'm making.
So it seems we ran out of questions now.
All right.
We say thank you again, and let's give a big hand to David. Thanks a lot.
Thank you all.
That was a great talk, and we are very happy that you presented your ideas to us. And yeah, if you come to Georgia, usually when we have somebody presenting here, we give him a bottle of wine or something like that. So if you would come to Georgia, we will keep a bottle of wine for you. So.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.